Hi everyone. So in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Lucy Letby case is an emblem of systemic failure in this country. I haven't done one of these videos for a while where I just talk about things thematically, so I thought it'd be nice to do one, and I've dug out some old footage for you to look at to give you something pleasant to look at while we talk about this catalogue of failure. So there's no doubt, I think we're all aware, that there's been an extraordinary series of systemic failures in order for us to arrive at the position we're at now, which is we're attempting to overturn this appalling, very obvious miscarriage of justice. And it all begins with the hospital, where the hospital is failing. When I say that, I don't mean failing in terms of the consultants. We'll get into the consultants in a second. But it's obviously failing in terms of its neonatal services. Very clearly, there's problems with staffing, there's problems with skill sets, there's problems with the sanitary conditions of the hospital, there seems to be organisational problems within the Northwest region. There are numerous problems. Then we obviously have the conduct of the consultants, shall we say, and the way that they're dealt with by the hospital. I would still be willing to defend the executives on the unit to a certain extent, and I certainly don't think they should have been arrested. But it's clear that the hospital doesn't deal with the situation quite as it should have done, firstly. And then secondly, it's quite clear that there's a whistleblowing problem, probably not just in the NHS, but across this country as a whole, but certainly in the healthcare system. It seems virtually impossible to blow the whistle on poor practice or mistakes, and certainly nothing worse than that without facing very serious consequences. Usually, seemingly, it's the end of your career. And then, obviously, after the consultants, we then have the systemic failure of the police, not having a clue how to investigate this, or perhaps even worse, it's possible, really, that a system of investigation and a focus on nailing a suspect has taken root in the police to such an extent that they just see getting any conviction as being a result. Then we have obviously the systemic failing of the selection of expert witnesses, which is clearly inadequate. We'll be talking about that later in the video. And then we have the failing of Dr. Evans, probably not a failing for his bank balance, but in terms of the evidence that he put in the court case, that's a massive failing. Then there's the failure of the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, who can't recognise this is poor evidence. They don't really have any mechanism to do that. Then you have the failings of the criminal justice system that we've discussed many times, with its inability to deal with medical and scientific evidence, this quite antiquated system, the failure of the judiciary, and so it goes on. And eventually have this extraordinary mess that exists today. Now, at the end of the Unheard Live event, when people were invited to stand up and ask questions, a gentleman stood up who, if I remember rightly, was quite an elderly gentleman, and so generationally sometimes people find these things difficult to accept. And he was saying, I couldn't really quite understand his point, but he was saying, we expected to believe that the police, the judiciary, and listed all these organisations have all failed and have all made fundamental mistakes. And of course the answer is yes. That's exactly what's happened. And to be honest, for me, it's not really that surprising. I guess the scale of this and the number of organisations, and perhaps the most surprising thing for me is the court system and what is allowed to go into the court system and what apparently counts as being evidence in the court system. That seems extraordinary. I would have assumed before this case that you needed a much, much higher bar of evidence for such a serious charge. Obviously not. But I think the problems that we've seen with the Lucy Letby case is indicative of a kind of crumbling infrastructure in this country. And I will return to the topic in hand in due course, but I want to talk about some of the other indicators of this that don't directly relate to the Lucy Letby case, because I believe that the failure of this case is emblematic of a wider malaise, perhaps in the country as a whole. So I think the current climate in particular is very difficult for young people. It's difficult for people of all ages, and it's not just entirely a generational thing, but it bears down with the greatest force on young people. And simply, it's an extremely difficult economic climate for them to exist in. And there are numerous indicators of this. The most obvious to me always is the housing market, which is very difficult for young people wherever you live in the country, but it's particularly brutal in the southeast of London. Now, I don't live in the southeast of London, but I know how difficult it is just to survive, let alone purchase a property. If you live in that part of the country, renting has become increasingly difficult. It used to be the situation that certainly over the last 20 to 30 years, for example, that if you had a bottom of the ladder job, then life could be difficult for you and it could be tricky for you to achieve a decent standard of living, which is completely wrong, but that was the case. Now it's getting to the point where the working poor are getting greater and greater in number. They're becoming a greater and greater proportion of the society. And that I've probably mentioned this in previous videos, but I would contrast that with when I was growing up, where all of my family, all of my friends, all of my peers, everyone I came into contact with, just automatically had a house. I'm sure that didn't apply to everyone in every part of the country, but it was just, there was no question of you won't be able to have a house. That wasn't even in the ballpark of something that would be feasible. And I knew people with every size of house, from down to like a bungalow type thing, right up to people who lived in mansions. But every single person had a house. In fact, I don't think I even went in a flat until I bought my first flat when I was about 24 years old. I think that was the first time I ever went in a flat in my life, because everyone had a house. Now it's unbelievably difficult for young people to get a house. And it's getting harder and harder, in fact, for them to even rent somewhere to live. And if they live in the southeast of London, they almost certainly won't live on their own. So that's the first indicator. The second one that I've noticed recently, and I'm sure it's quite evident to other people as well, is the cost of transportation. So the train service now is phenomenally expensive. Again, if you want to travel to London, it's almost now impossible to travel to London if you're a poor person. If you're on the dole in particular, you've just got absolutely no chance. I mean, when I've been travelling recently, it's been £90 for a return, but that's to travel at the most inconvenient time possible. It's £250 to travel at anything like a convenient time. And then and that's a pretty straightforward journey that's, I think it's under 2 hours for me. And if I was to travel at a sensible time, then they would say, it's 250 quid. And that's not a particular, that's very much a mainline route, essentially. As soon as you get anything unusual where you're going across different regions and stuff, it gets ridiculous. Obviously, it's £250 or even £80 is a lot of money to travel somewhere if you don't have a lot in the first place. I'm not sure about the roads because I don't spend a lot of time on the roads, but I've heard they're not much better, and that I've certainly heard people talking about potholes and them being in a state of disrepair. What I will say is that where I live, the nearest town to where I live, because I don't live in a town, you're pretty much guaranteed to be in a traffic jam if you try and drive in or out of it, which is not a good indicator that the roads are any good, but I'm not particularly well qualified to talk about that. In terms of rail, of course, we also had HS2 that was a phenomenal waste of money in my estimation, but I won't talk about that too much. The next indicator of financial difficulty is, and the kind of economic malaise, is the reduction in services, escalation of council tax. So people are paying more and more and more council tax for less and less and less services. At the same time, numerous councils are bankrupt, all of which is indicative of a very troubled economic situation. The next thing is all basic bills have increased rapidly. Even something like water has escalated at a time when numerous water companies are flat broke, in massive debt. They're going to need to be held up by the government for a significant period of time. Then this is not necessarily directly related to the state. There are numerous reasons for this, but obviously food prices have increased rapidly to such an extent that the usage of food banks has become quite endemic. So I'll just read you an article quickly on that. This is from The Guardian, 9th of October 2024. More than 9 million Britons vulnerable to reliance on food banks, research finds. More than 9 million people in the UK experience levels of poverty and hunger so extreme they are vulnerable to reliance on charity food handouts, according to research. A report by the charity Trussell found Labour would fail to deliver its manifesto promise to remove the moral scar of food banks unless it tackled low household incomes in this group, which amounted to 1 in 7 of the population. There were 1 million more people in what the report defined as hunger and hardship, living on income at least 25% below the relative poverty line than 5 years ago, and nearly 3 million more than there were 2 decades ago, the study found. So it's important to note, obviously those are very disturbing figures, to know that 1 in 7 people face this kind of food poverty. And of course, it's important to note that food banks are not some sort of government initiative or anything like that. It's just generous people. I've tried to give something on occasion when I can, and particularly at Christmas. I do give stuff. But it's if they reached a situation where people couldn't give out the kindness of their hearts, that resource is no longer there, and those people that need it to survive, where do they turn to then? I ask myself. And then another thing that kind of overarches the whole thing and all these problems that I'm already discussing, I'm going to come back to the Lucy Letby case in a second, is the debt in this country. So I'm looking at the UK National Debt Clock, which is a website, nationaldebtclock.co.uk, which currently stands at £3.2 trillion. So that means that it's doubled in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, it was approximately 1.6 trillion. That means that the UK debt to GDP ratio has now reached over 100%. So it means the debt is greater than the gross domestic product of the nation. So essentially, if for an entire year, every single aspect of economic activity was just put to one side, the country still wouldn't have paid off the on the balance sheet debt at the end of the year. But of course, the debt's going up all the time. As I just kind of alluded to, this figure doesn't even include what are called off the balance sheet expenses and figures as well. But that's a kind of a side issue. The point is that if you look at historically Britain's debt to GDP ratio, it looks like a ski jump because it was very, very high, approximately 250% just after the Second World War. But of course, there had just been an almighty effort to win the Second World War, and then there was rationing for 10 years. So then you'll see it come down very, very rapidly till about 2000, and then it starts to go up again quite steadily and now quite steeply to the point where it's reached over 100% of GDP for the first time since 1963. The difference was in 1963, it was coming down rapidly and continued to come down rapidly, whereas now it's going up significantly. So that is a kind of overarching issue that feeds into all these other economic issues that I've already discussed. Now, I'm not going to discuss the underlying reasons for all of this, and it's not unique to Britain. The United States debt, as an example, as a prominent example, is increasing very, very quickly, and they've actually reached their highest, I believe, the highest ever ratio of debt to GDP, higher than the Second World War. Of course, they weren't as centrally involved in the Second World War. But that brings us neatly to the two systems that are particularly central to the Lucy Letby case, the judiciary and healthcare. I don't want to talk about the police because I don't think they're any better or worse than has been the case historically. Now, anyone reasonable, anyone that's been around for a long time, like certainly I think people in my generation and even younger and certainly older would recognise very easily that the NHS is struggling. It's pretty evident if you just try to use everyday services. As an example of this, a while ago I had a bit of a throat infection. It wouldn't go away for ages. And I wasn't concerned, but I just thought, okay, maybe I should go and see a GP. So I phoned up my surgery and I believe they offered me an appointment 2.5 weeks into the future. And I was like, well, that's great, but I won't be ill then. So the overwhelming likelihood is my throat infection will have gone. And then, but I mean, I think that's kind of symptomatic of broader problems, of course. I mean, there's something like that simply did not happen when I was younger. So I've looked up a few articles to underline how bad things are in the NHS. Of course, many of you listening to this have worked in the NHS, and some of you still do work in the NHS, so you probably don't need me to tell you, but let me give you a few indicators of how bad it is. So firstly, waiting lists. So in August 2025, approximately 7.4 million people were on hospital waiting lists for planned treatment in England, with the median waiting time at 13.4 weeks. While efforts are being made to reduce the backlog with targets in place, the 18-week treatment standard has not been met since 2016. So that's all pretty self-explanatory. 10% of the population, essentially, just slightly over, are on hospital waiting lists, and realistically, there's no prospect of the backlog being reduced, and the bare minimum treatment standard hasn't been met for 10 years. So then I have a few more articles to read to you. Many of you may have seen this article in The Independent. NHS medical negligence costs hit £60 billion as childbirth injury payouts surge. The NHS's total liabilities for medical negligence have hit £60 billion, the National Audit Office has said. The amount has been attributed to the rising number of claims, combined with more being paid out per claim and spiralling legal fees. The estimated fee is the total that would be needed to settle all NHS clinical negligence claims as of the end of March this year, including any claims not yet received for the period before then. So the Lucy Letby case, of course, feeds into issues with maternity. Now, several people who have forgotten more about medical matters than I will ever know have highlighted the problems with maternity services in the NHS. So there's this article from The Times that talks about the total cost of harm from clinical negligence being £13.6 billion in the 2021 to 22 reporting year. 60% of the cost of harm was for maternity claims, amounting to £8.2 billion for the year. So then I found some discussion about this on Reddit, and someone was suggesting that, I'll read exactly what they said. At this point, it ought to be on the table for maternity to no longer be covered by the NHS. So obviously that's a fairly extraordinary claim, and it's challenged. Someone just literally says, what? And then the original poster says, if it were any other industry, you would sever the hemorrhaging limb that shows no sign of improving the moment a whiff of the size of claims that obstetrics regularly dishes out was first caught wind of. Also seems to be a specialty allergic to improving despite a report into failings at an obstetric service every other year. I would sooner have providers compete with each other and face the full brunt of litigation when things go wrong that the NHS seems to accept as an occupational hazard. No, it will not improve outcomes. I'm acutely aware of what goes on in the US. I cannot, however, feel sympathetic to the eye-watering sums that seem to now simply be accepted as part of running an obstetric service on the public purse. So there's then some further discussion between these posters, but it's interesting that the original poster is citing obstetrics as being so important. So we've heard from Dr. Martin Pittman on this matter, and when he tried to blow the whistle in quite a mild and moderate way, just simply pointing out we're not delivering a good enough service, we're beginning to deliver what is a failing service in his estimation, that didn't go particularly well for him. But yet the NHS is perfectly willing, as this person rightly points out, to live with these astronomical figures that are occurring due to failures. Everyone's happy to live with that as long as no one blows the whistle. So then it wasn't terribly difficult to find a few articles about maternity failures in the NHS. The first one, these on the BBC, it's unforgivable, the problem at the heart of the NHS's maternity care failures. So I'm not going to read out too much of this article because it goes on and on for a very long time and talks about essentially nationwide failings across the maternity system and familiar things about maternity-related payments. And let me just read this section. There are now calls for the government to establish a national maternity inquiry rather than relying on individual ones at different hospitals and trusts. More than 36,000 people have signed up to one such petition, led by 2 sets of bereaved parents, while campaign group Maternity Safety Alliance is making a similar call. So far, the Department of Health hasn't committed to a national inquiry. Both Dr. Kirkup and Professor Walker argue that the time for inquiries is over. Another inquiry will find exactly the same things that we find at the moment, said Professor Walker. We know what the problems are. What is needed is a national plan to improve maternity care, argues Dr. Kirkup. He said he has been working with the Department of Health on drawing up plans to improve team working and providing compassionate care. So anyway, it goes on. But there's a government gov.uk press release, 14 NHS trusts the focus of national maternity investigation. 14 trusts part of rapid national investigation maternity and newborn baby cares across England, investigation to make recommendations to urgently improve care and safety in maternity and neonatal care, selected hospital trust scope and aims finalised with input from bereaved and harmed families. So this is yet another angle of the Lucy Letby case where we know there have been these failings in maternity care, we know there have been these failings in neonatal care, and I've tried to highlight these to a certain extent, both on this channel and in my book, but it's difficult to cover every topic in its full depth. I guess I can do that on the channel, and I'll do that as much as I possibly can. But the rabbit hole truly goes deeper and deeper and deeper, and there's more and more and more problems and issues. And yet, incredibly, despite these enormous systemic problems, despite the issues that we're aware of at the Council of Chester that are common knowledge now, it's all been pinned on one nurse because it's convenient. And then I'll just briefly mention the inquiry into the Leeds NHS maternity failings that has been announced very recently due to obvious problems at the Leeds Teaching Hospital NHS Trust. And then I'll just go over some further articles. This first one, again, is in the Independent, inside the looming NHS winter crisis as hospitals face Armageddon. I don't know if you can truly describe this as a crisis when it simply happens every year. It's just a normal situation now. It's only October, yet the picture across NHS wards up and down the country is one of concern, with medics telling the Independent they fear a winter crisis on a scale only seen at the height of the pandemic. One A&E consultant warns the health service is facing something akin to Armageddon. Every year, the NHS is under huge pressure at winter, a result of long-standing problems, including underfunding and an ageing population. But hospitals are already battling an astonishing number of flu and COVID patients this year, in part due to a hugely concerning early flu season alongside a surge in A&E demand and staffing cuts. So just to reflect on this is the kind of climate for the health service that would result in the Lucy Letby case, one of the infants being born in a toilet. It's because there's such a demand on these services and they're so underfunded and under such pressure and failing to such an obvious degree now that ridiculous steps need to be taken in order just for basic functionality to be carried out. So then there's another article here on the British Medical Association, NHS in deep crisis, says doctor's leader. The whole nation knows that the health service is in deep crisis. The family doctor is harder than ever to see. Waits for hospital appointments are too often measured in years, not days and weeks. Each year, tens of thousands of people wait more than 24 hours to be admitted to hospital from the emergency department. Public health has been broken by restructure and neglect, with no attempt to revive it despite the pandemic exposing how fragile our nation's health has become. Despite understaffing across the NHS, we are facing the absurd spectacle of doctors out of work. Hospital doctors, GPs, medical academics and public health doctors are all facing underemployment or training bottlenecks, jeopardising the futures of talented and dedicated doctors. The social contract between the medical profession and society has been broken. Each of these issues is contributing to the sense today that the NHS is far removed from it once was and far removed from what it should be. Our patients rightly expect far better because they remember the NHS when it worked, a family doctor who knew them, an emergency department that was properly resourced without the prospect of being treated in a corridor. They remember an NHS that could treat them safely and with dignity. No one should underestimate this crisis. As doctors, we see it unfolding every day of our working lives. patients unable to access treatment, doctors unable to provide the care they were trained to deliver, a spiralling crisis and a disjointed health service which demands a solution. So a long-term plan for the NHS is not just appealing, but is essential. So the situation, in fact, is so bad that even the NBC News, obviously an American media outlet, reports here about the UK's public health service being in crisis, threatening an institution at the centre of British culture. Once touted as the envy of the world, the National Health Service is now broken, according to the government. So one thing I haven't mentioned previously is that I used to write for and edit healthcare publications in the past. So I've written thousands of articles and edited thousands of articles about the NHS, and I've interviewed a lot of top NHS personnel when I used to do this job. Now, that was obviously the universe preparing me for what I'm doing now, because I didn't see the significance of it at the time, but now that's proven to be very useful. So at the time, the publication that I used to work with and write for, the gentleman that founded that publication used to tell me the NHS will collapse sooner or later. He said, I'm surprised it's gone on as long as it has, but unless there is a massive increase in funding, it's just not going to survive. And obviously that's not a nice thing to hear, and it hasn't happened yet, even though, of course, there's backdoor stealth privatisation of things, as I'm sure everyone listening to this is aware. But he did say that things are just going to get worse and worse. There'll be bigger and bigger crises, and eventually there'll be private healthcare. You'll have to have private insurance. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I'm just reporting what he said. And although I learnt a lot, he definitely knew more than me at the time when he said this. But I think it's very clear that despite the very diligent efforts of people that work within the healthcare system, there are massive problems. These are systemic problems that are endemic, and they may never be solved. We don't know if they'll ever be solved. We don't know if the NHS will ever get back to where it was before, but certainly it is definitely failing. And I think, considering that historically, undoubtedly, Britain would see itself as superior in terms of the healthcare it delivered to the United States, to have an article in a US publication talking about the decline, deterioration and crisis at the heart of the NHS is quite a sobering reflection on where the service is today. So then the second system, which is very obviously failing, which is related to the Lucy Letby case, is the judiciary. There's obviously been a litany of miscarriages in recent years. We know that Lucy is suffering one of those. There have been other nurses. There's the post office inquiry, Andrew Malkinson, Tom Hayes, Peter Sullivan, Justin Plummer. The list goes on and on. It's very clear that the criminal justice system isn't fit for purpose. It can't deal with medical, scientific or financial data, to list but 3 items of complex information that it's required to deal with. It's antiquated, out of date and inadequate. There are serious problems, in my estimation, with the adversarial approach that have been laid absolutely bare in Lucy's case, with some of the ridiculous things that occurred in court. And over the many decades and even centuries that this system has now been in place, barristers have built up an armoury of tactics that they can use to gain a conviction when the evidence shouldn't really point that way. That's before you're dealing with all this complex information the system clearly just isn't designed to deal with. And then there's obviously big problems with the selection of expert witnesses that could hardly be any clearer, considering the conduct of Dr. Evans and the nonsense that he put in this court case. But I've been provided with an article today that gives a further indication of this. So this was actually sent to me by Michelle Warden. It's in the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Family Courts calls for urgent review of all cases involving Melanie Gill. The incoming Victims Commissioner has called for an urgent review of all family cases involving Melanie Gill. An expert witness in the family court who's a bit dubious. Does that sound familiar to anyone? An unregulated psychologist who has been given evidence up to 200 times. So completely unregulated, so it would appear. Claire Waxman said the removal of children on the advice of unregulated experts is a national scandal on par with the Post Office injustice, although it seems there are multiple national scandals on par with the Post Office injustice. It comes after the Bureau of Investigative Journalism revealed that a High Court judge overturned the evidence provided by Gill in the case of a woman whose daughters were taken from her 5 years ago. The mother, Sarah, said Gill has caused a lifetime of damage by advising a judge she had alienated her 2 children from their father. Following Gill's evidence, the family court ruled Sarah could only have fortnightly supervised contact with her daughters, then aged 6 and 9. But in a judgment published on Thursday, Mrs. Justice Judd said Gill's evidence and the findings by district judge that followed had been based on a mistaken foundation. Judd's ruling had led to calls for other cases involving Gill to be urgently reviewed amid concerns that Sarah's is the tip of the iceberg. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism has established that Gill's advice has led to the removal of at least a dozen children from their mothers, including in cases where fathers had been found to be abusive. And she is not the only expert who has been advising the family courts on parental alienation, the idea that a child has rejected a parent having been turned against them by the other. The concept is now recognised as a harmful pseudoscience. Does that sound familiar after shaken baby syndrome, after the things that we've heard in this court case? That is often used to discredit claims of domestic abuse. Waxman, who is currently the Victims Commissioner for London, but is due to take up the role for England and Wales in the new year, says she has been sounding the alarm about the dangerous use of unregulated experts for 5 years. I've seen appalling cases where unregulated parental alienation experts have torn children from their protective parents who were victims of domestic or sexual abuse, and even led to children being handed back to the very person who harmed them, all because those experts dismissed disclosure of abuse as lies. Waxman says Judd's ruling must now signal an end to this harmful practice. I'm calling on the government and the presidency of the Family Division, the top family judge in England, to urgently review every case of Melanie Gill's and any other unregulated expert who diagnosed parental alienation where children were subsequently removed from the protective parent. It is a national scandal that unregulated experts have been given so much unchecked power, endangering survivors and their children and inflicting irreversible damage. It is on a par with the Post Office scandal, and we must seek truth, justice and protection, she said, in reference to the huge miscarriage of justice in which hundreds of workers were mistakenly prosecuted for theft. Gill did not respond to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's request for comment, but has previously said she is the victim of a witch hunt and is being targeted by feminist campaigners who have a biased view about domestic abuse. Guidance is clear that only psychologists registered with the Health and Care Professions Council have the necessary skills and training to assess or diagnose, but judges can appoint experts who are not regulated, although the body that sets the rules for the family courts is considering a ban on the use of such witnesses. What a novel concept, banning expert witnesses who don't have the necessary skills or training and are not registered with a body. Continuing the article, a spokesperson for the Ministry of Justice said, "We share the concerns about these unregulated parental alienation experts, and we are working with the Family Procedure Rule Committee to prevent them from giving evidence in the family courts." So I won't continue to... let me just read this to you. The scale is possibly huge. Gill has spoken about being the expert in more than 150 cases. So this is extraordinary. It is scary. How else can you describe it other than scary? I don't even want to give a kind of reasoned assessment of this. It's just a frightening thing that children could be taken away seemingly from their mothers, but certainly one of the parents, on the basis of evidence that is, at best, it's generous to describe it as pseudoscience, that is being put forward by people who are unregulated, who are operating as expert witnesses in the court. It's extraordinary. And then I would also point to this article that's been published in the British Medical Journal literally today as I'm recording this. Medical testimony in criminal cases needs reform, by two familiar authors, Drs. Felena Dimitrova and Dr. Philip Hammond, who will be known to people that have been following the Lucy Letby case. Concerns about the role of expert evidence in criminal trials centre on ensuring that judges and juries hear a fair and balanced interpretation of complex, nuanced and uncertain medical evidence in the UK's adversarial legal system. Currently, there is no adequate assurance that appropriate experts will be engaged by either legal team, nor that their testimony will be scientifically or statistically sound. There is an urgent need to reform the system of medical expert testimony to avoid miscarriages of justice. The UK lacks formal regulation of medical expert witnesses. There is no statutory register, no mandated peer review of the evidence submitted in court, and no oversight from royal colleges. Although the General Medical Council offers guidance on providing expert evidence, it is largely up to individual doctors to decide if they are qualified to act as an expert, subject ultimately to the court's control. Courts may approve doctors who would not be considered experts by their peers, or who have long since retired and lack current understanding of the specialty areas they are analysing. The adversarial structure of our legal system creates strong incentives for expert shopping, seeking out those willing to frame opinions in support of a particular narrative. Although experts are formally required to provide impartial evidence, they are often not held accountable if they fail to do so. This dynamic allows some experts to provide opinions aligned with the interests of the instructing party. Many excellent clinicians that we have spoken to who would be suitable experts choose to avoid working in the criminal justice system, citing concerns about scientific integrity. Historically, miscarriages of justice have arisen from the misuse of statistics and unreliable medical expert testimony. The wrongful conviction of Sally Clark for the murder of her two sons is a striking example. The conviction relied on statistically inaccurate claims by Roy Meadow, a professor of paediatrics. After this case, courts and judges, often ill-equipped to evaluate statistical and scientific validity, relied on the discredited Meadows law, allowing similarly flawed testimony in other trials. In 2016, barrister Ben Myers, who later defended Lucy Letby, co-authored a report for Justice, an all-party campaign organisation. The report recommended that joint expert reports be prepared before trial proceedings. This would require experts from both the prosecution and defence teams to collaborate, clearly outlining areas of agreement and disagreement with supporting evidence. Where experts largely concur, the presence on the stand might be unnecessary, potentially reducing trial length, cost, and risk of bias. In cases of substantial disagreement, the court would benefit from a clear written record of expert divergences before testimony. But this system still depends on both parties having access to appropriately qualified experts. A fairer approach would ensure that both sides have access to suitably qualified medical experts from the outset, allowing a more balanced evaluation of evidence. Calls for reform of the rules governing expert medical evidence are not new. In 2011, the Law Commission recommended stricter admissibility criteria for expert evidence in criminal trials, but those proposals were never adopted. Reform is needed, a register of expert witnesses with proper clarity about their disciplines, regulated and maintained by professional medical bodies. In our view, multidisciplinary panels rather than lone experts should be instructed in complex cases. For highly complex clinical cases, we think an inquisitorial approach, where the judge actively investigates the evidence rather than relying solely on adversarial contest, may provide a more reliable framework than the current system. So it's very difficult to disagree with the comments there, the very informed comments of Doctors Dimitrova and Hammond. So they lastly mentioned the 2011 Law Commission recommendations that should have been implemented. But because of everything I discussed early in the video, which is indicative of the malaise that is central to our culture now, really, the immediate barrier and the immediate problem you have with implementing anything, the first response you hear is that will cost too much money. And indeed, that was exactly what was said about the 2011 Law Commission recommendations. Now, there are serious question marks about this, with some people saying that they would save money, not cost money, but it can still be viewed as a legitimate response to just say it will cost too much money. Have you seen the state of the public finances? Have you seen the other problems we've got? We can't enact and implement this. Now, I hope when this is unravelled, obviously there's the family court issue that we've heard about, but that's very much lower profile than the Lucy Letby case. The Lucy Letby case provides a real opportunity to achieve reform, and it is vital for us to push forward. Now, I've had people in the comments whose view I very much respect, saying that this is too big to fail. It won't be allowed to be overturned because there's too much at stake and there's too many organisations I mentioned. And it's just, this nettle is too prickly to grasp, frankly. And I can understand that argument. We just need to keep putting the pressure on and do everything possible, because I won't stop doing this until Lucy comes out of prison. And then I'll begin the next campaign, which will be multifaceted, which will be about reforming the healthcare system. It'll be about getting compensation for Lucy. And, I will probably have a voice in this niche, and I will use that voice for good in any way that I can. I do have some ideas about things that I'd like to do. But overall, I'm very pessimistic about the future of this country because of the very clear systemic failings that are now at the heart of multiple systems that are extremely important and that are fundamental to any kind of remotely, civilized would be a reasonable word to describe it, civilized country. Like we are literally descending into the point where it's debatable whether we're a civilized country anymore. Free speech has already been taken away, pretty much. We already know that it's very difficult to give an honest view on anything, and that certainly hasn't been protected legally. There have been numerous recent decisions that have worked against that. So I'm not optimistic because of the terrible financial situation, everything that points to the infrastructure crumbling, the institutions that are all failing, and we haven't talked about the political system. I don't wish to have a political platform. I don't wish to suggest the political reasons why this has occurred. I'm sure you'll all have your opinions in the comments. It'll be interesting to read them. And I don't wish to talk about the government. I don't wish to talk about the House of Commons. But I think most people would be of the view that the government and the political system and the political process generally is not a particularly savoury spectacle to view at the best of times. All that I can ultimately say is that I will work solidly on Lucy's campaign, doing whatever I possibly can in whatever capacity is possible for as long as I possibly can, for as long as it takes. Now, I really don't want to be working on this 10 years from now or 15 years from now, but if that's what it takes, that's what I'll do. Obviously, I want Lucy to come out of prison while she can still have some sort of relatively happy future. I believe that's possible, and I believe she can still be happy and she can still be fulfilled. And we're going to make certain that when she does come out, she can be financially comfortable for the rest of her life. And then there are many other things that need addressing in relation to the criminal justice system and the healthcare system. I would be unlikely to be involved with the latter, but if I can have a small voice in the miscarriage of justice space, then I will use that voice. But the theme of this video is that the Lucy Letby case is ultimately about systemic failure, and in that respect, in my estimation at least, it's emblematic of a much wider failing and malaise that is at the heart of this country. I don't really know where to start when it comes to making things better, but I'm reminded of a quote by one of my heroes, Bill Shankly, who was a legendary manager of Liverpool Football Club. Now, I'm certainly not a fan of Liverpool. In fact, I wasn't even alive when Shankly managed the team. It was what he stood for that is something that I admire and something that is important. And I'd like to cite one quotation in particular that he said that I've always admired, which is the following: even in the army, when you went in the services during the war, you'd get some horrible jobs. You'd go in the cookhouse and have to dry about 6,000 dishes. Well, if I had a job to do, even if it was scrubbing the floor, I wanted my floor to be cleaner than yours. Now, if everybody thinks along those lines and does all the small jobs to the best of their ability, then that's honesty, and the world will be better. I'm not sure that those simple values can quite compete with what we're dealing with today, but all I can say is that I've got this job to do, and I'll do it to the best of my ability for as long as it takes. And I've met many brilliant people through doing this, and I know that they'll do exactly the same thing. And if everyone did that, instead of having their hand out, salivating at the prospect of what's in it for them, as certain parasites have in the Lucy Letby case, maybe the world would indeed be a better place.